May 31st, 1916. Your seaman Jack Cornwell, just 16 years old, standing at your gun aboard HMS Chester as the largest naval battle in history unfolds around you. The North Sea is churning with the wakes of 250 warships, British and German dreadnoughts trading salvos that can be heard 50 miles away. A German shell screams overhead and explodes against your ship's armor. The blast throws you to the deck, shrapnel tearing through your chest. Your gun crew is dead or dying around you, but you drag yourself back to your position. You're bleeding badly, probably dying, but you stay at your post because that's what sailors do. You don't know it yet, but you're witnessing the end of an era. This is the last time the great battle fleets will meet in open combat. After today, naval warfare will never be the same again. But here's what makes the Battle of Jutland so incredible. It wasn't won by the side with more ships or bigger guns. It was decided by split-second decisions, communication failures, and pure, dumb luck. And when the smoke cleared, both sides claimed victory, while secretly knowing they'd learned some terrifying lessons about modern naval warfare. Today, I'm going to tell you how the Battle of Jutland changed everything we thought we knew about fighting at sea, why this massive clash left both navies traumatized, and how a single afternoon in 1916 ended the age of the battleship before most people realized it had begun. The Royal Navy in 1916 was the most powerful fleet in human history. For over a century, Britannia had ruled the waves with an iron fist. British admirals grew up believing their ships were invincible and their sailors the finest in the world. They had a saying, "The British fleet always wins." Admiral Sir John Jellicoe commanded the Grand Fleet from his flagship HMS Iron Duke. 24 dreadnought battleships, 3 battlecruisers, and dozens of smaller vessels. Enough firepower to level a city. Jellicoe was known as the only man who could lose the war in an afternoon. Because if he lost the Grand Fleet, Britain would starve. The pressure on Jellicoe was immense. Every decision he made could determine whether Britain survived or fell. He was cautious by nature, methodical, careful. Exactly the kind of commander you'd want protecting your empire's lifeline. But his caution would also cost him the decisive victory everyone expected. The German high seas fleet was smaller but newer. Admiral Reinhard Scheer had 18 battleships and 5 battlecruisers, but his ships had better armor and more advanced fire control systems. German naval doctrine emphasized quality over quantity. They couldn't match British numbers, so they built better ships. Scheer was everything Jellicoe wasn't. Aggressive, willing to take risks, ready to gamble everything on a single throw of the dice. He knew his fleet couldn't win a prolonged war against the Royal Navy, so he was looking for that one perfect moment when he could catch part of the British fleet alone and destroy it. For 2 years, these fleets had been playing a deadly game of cat and mouse in the North Sea. The Germans would sortie out, hoping to catch part of the British fleet alone. The British would rush to intercept, trying to bring their full strength to bear. But every time, one side or the other would turn away before a decisive battle could develop. The British public was getting frustrated. They'd built the world's most powerful navy, and it seemed to be doing nothing but sitting in port. Where was the great victory that would end German naval power forever? The pressure for action was building on both sides. That changed on May 31st when German intelligence intercepted British radio signals and thought they'd found their chance. Admiral Franz Hipper would take his battlecruisers north toward Norway, hoping to lure out part of the British fleet. When the British took the bait, Scheer would appear with the main German fleet and destroy them. It was a clever plan, and it might have worked against a less prepared enemy. But the Germans had made one crucial mistake. They assumed their codes were secure. What the Germans didn't know was that British codebreakers had cracked their naval codes months earlier. The Admiralty knew the high seas fleet was coming out and ordered both Jellicoe and Admiral David Beatty to sea. Instead of catching a few British ships, the Germans were about to face the entire Grand Fleet. Room 40, the British code-breaking unit, had given the Royal Navy an enormous advantage. They could read German naval signals almost as quickly as the Germans themselves. But this intelligence advantage would be wasted by poor communication and bad decisions. The first contact came at 2:20 p.m. when British and German light cruisers stumbled into each other while investigating a neutral steamer. Within minutes, both sides were calling for help, and the greatest naval battle in history was about to begin. It was pure chance. Neither side had planned to meet at that exact spot. But once the shooting started, there was no turning back. The carefully laid plans of both admirals were about to collide with the chaos of actual combat. Beatty arrived first with 6 battlecruisers, expecting to find only Hipper's ships. The British had a slight advantage in numbers and firepower, and Beatty was confident of victory. He was the Royal Navy's golden boy, young, aggressive, popular with the press. This was his chance to win the decisive battle that would make him a national hero. The battlecruiser action that followed was like nothing anyone had ever seen. These ships were floating fortresses, each one carrying 8 15-inch guns that could hurl a shell weighing as much as a small car over 20 miles. When they opened fire, the noise was indescribable, a continuous thunder that shook the sea itself. The shells themselves were marvels of engineering, each one precisely machined, filled with hundreds of pounds of high explosive, designed to punch through the thickest armor ever made. When they hit, the impact was like a small earthquake. At first, things went badly for the British. German gunnery was superb, and their shells were finding their targets while British shots went wide. HMS Lion, Beatty's flagship, took several hits that knocked out 2 of her gun turrets. HMS Tiger was badly damaged. The British were getting the worst of it. The Germans had spent years perfecting their fire control systems. Their rangefinders were more accurate, their plotting rooms more efficient, their gunners better trained. It showed in the accuracy of their fire. They were hitting with their first salvos, while the British were still finding the range. Then, at 3:26 p.m., disaster struck. HMS Indefatigable took a direct hit from the German battlecruiser Von der Tann. The shell penetrated her rear turret and detonated the magazine. The explosion was so massive that it lifted the entire rear half of the ship out of the water. When the smoke cleared, Indefatigable was gone. All 1,019 men aboard her died in seconds. The explosion was visible for miles, a column of flame and smoke that rose thousands of feet into the air. Sailors on other ships watched in horror as one of the Royal Navy's most powerful warships simply vanished. It was supposed to be impossible. These ships were designed to survive anything. 26 minutes later, it happened again. HMS Queen Mary took 2 hits from the German ship Derfflinger. The shells punched through her armor and exploded in her forward magazines. The blast was even more spectacular than the first, a column of flame and smoke that rose thousands of feet into the air. Queen Mary broke in half and sank immediately, taking 1,266 men with her. Midshipman John Jellicoe, the admiral's son, was serving on a nearby destroyer and watched Queen Mary die. He later wrote, "She seemed to lift right out of the water, then break in 2 like a stick. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. These were supposed to be the most powerful ships in the world." Beatty watched 2 of his ships disappear in less than half an hour. That's when he made his famous comment to his flag captain, "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." Turn 2 points closer to the enemy. Even facing disaster, he was going to keep fighting. It was typical Beatty, aggressive to the point of recklessness. A more cautious commander might have withdrawn to reassess the situation, but Beatty's instinct was always to attack, and that instinct was about to save the British fleet. But Beatty's luck was about to change. At 4:33 p.m., his light cruisers spotted smoke on the southern horizon. It was Scheer with the entire German high seas fleet. 18 battleships in line of battle, their guns trained on the British battlecruisers. The sight must have been terrifying. An entire fleet of enemy battleships emerging from the haze like something out of a nightmare. Beatty's 4 remaining battlecruisers were suddenly facing odds of more than 4 to 1. Suddenly, Beatty realized he was facing the entire German fleet with just 4 battlecruisers. If he stayed to fight, he'd be annihilated. But if he ran north, he could lead the Germans straight into Jellicoe's trap. It was the most important decision of his career. The next hour would test every skill Beatty had learned in 20 years of naval service. He had to stay close enough to keep the Germans interested, but far enough away to avoid being destroyed. Too close, and his ships would be sunk. Too far, and the Germans might realize it was a trap and turn away. Beatty turned north and ran for his life, the German fleet in hot pursuit. For the next hour, his battered ships played the role of bait, staying just out of range while leading sheer toward the Grand Fleet. It was a masterpiece of tactical maneuvering, but it came at a cost. HMS Princess Royal was hit again and nearly sank. The chase covered over 40 miles at speeds of up to 25 knots. German shells fell around the fleeing British ships like deadly rain, but Beatty's captains handled their ships brilliantly, weaving and dodging to avoid the worst of the fire. At 6:14 p.m., Jellicoe finally appeared on the horizon with 24 battleships deployed in line of battle. The Germans suddenly found themselves facing the entire Grand Fleet, a wall of steel and guns stretching from horizon to horizon. Scheer had walked into exactly the trap the British had been setting for 2 years. The sight of the Grand Fleet deploying for battle was one of the most magnificent spectacles in naval history. 24 of the most powerful warships ever built, their guns trained on the enemy, ready to deliver the decisive blow that would end German naval power forever. What happened next should have been the decisive naval battle of the war. The Grand Fleet had the Germans outnumbered and outgunned. Jellicoe had achieved the perfect tactical position. He'd crossed the T, putting his entire fleet in position to fire on the head of the German line, while only the leading German ships could return fire. For 15 minutes, it looked like the Royal Navy was about to achieve the crushing victory it had been seeking for 2 years. German ships were taking heavy damage, and it seemed impossible for them to escape. But naval warfare in 1916 wasn't like the Age of Sail. These ships could move at 25 knots and change course in minutes. Scheer realized his danger immediately and executed a brilliant maneuver called the battle turn away. His entire fleet turned 180 degrees simultaneously and disappeared into the mist and smoke. It was one of the most skillful fleet maneuvers in naval history. 18 battleships turning in perfect unison under heavy fire, each captain trusting his neighbors to execute the turn precisely. One mistake would have caused a collision that could have destroyed multiple ships. Jellicoe was left firing at empty water. The decisive battle he'd been preparing for his entire career had lasted exactly 15 minutes, and the enemy had escaped. The frustration must have been overwhelming. Jellicoe had maneuvered perfectly, achieved the ideal tactical position, and then watched his enemy slip away like smoke. It was the kind of moment that haunts a commander for the rest of his life. But Scheer wasn't done. Thinking the British had been fooled by his maneuver, he turned back toward them 20 minutes later. Once again, he found himself facing the entire Grand Fleet. Once again, he had to execute an emergency turn to escape destruction. It was an incredible mistake. Scheer had escaped one trap only to walk straight into another. His aggressive instincts had nearly cost him his entire fleet. This time, Scheer ordered his battlecruisers to charge the British line in a death ride, a desperate sacrifice to cover his fleet's escape. Hipper's ships, already battered from hours of fighting, turned toward the British battleships and opened fire at point-blank range. It was the naval equivalent of the charge of the Light Brigade, a hopeless attack against overwhelming odds, carried out with incredible courage by men who knew they were probably going to die. It should have been suicide, but the German ships were incredibly tough. HMS Invincible, trying to finish off the crippled German battlecruiser Lützow, took a direct hit that detonated her magazines. She exploded just like Indefatigable and Queen Mary, killing all but 6 of her 1,032-man crew. The explosion split Invincible exactly in half. Her bow and stern sections remained upright on the shallow bottom, sticking out of the water like tombstones. It was a grim reminder of how quickly these mighty ships could be destroyed. As darkness fell, both fleets were still maneuvering for advantage. Jellicoe had the Germans trapped against their own coast, with no way home except through the British fleet. All he had to do was wait for dawn and finish them off. But night fighting in 1916 was chaos. Ships couldn't identify friend from foe at more than a few hundred yards. Signals were confused, communications broke down, and both sides ended up firing at their own ships as often as the enemy. But Scheer had one last card to play. During the night, he managed to slip his fleet past the rear of the British line in a series of confused actions that left ships on both sides firing at shadows. By dawn, the High Seas Fleet was safely back in port, and the Battle of Jutland was over. It was a masterpiece of night navigation and seamanship. Scheer had threaded his entire fleet through the British formation in complete darkness, avoiding the trap that should have destroyed him. The casualty figures told the story. The British lost 3 battlecruisers, 3 armored cruisers, and 8 destroyers, 6,094 men killed. The Germans lost 1 battleship, 1 battlecruiser, 4 light cruisers, and 5 destroyers, 2,551 men killed. By the numbers, it looked like a German victory. But numbers don't tell the whole story. The British had lost more ships, but they could afford the losses. The Germans had escaped, but they were still trapped in port by the British blockade. But the strategic situation hadn't changed at all. The Grand Fleet was still blockading Germany, and the High Seas Fleet was still trapped in port. More importantly, both sides had learned some terrifying lessons about modern naval warfare. The battle that was supposed to decide the war at sea had decided nothing. Germany was still being slowly strangled by the British blockade, and the Royal Navy was still supreme. But both fleets had been badly shaken by what they'd experienced. The British discovered that their battle cruisers, designed to be fast and powerful, had sacrificed too much armor for speed. 3 ships had blown up from single hits, something that should have been impossible. British shells were also defective, failing to penetrate German armor even when they hit. The Admiralty immediately ordered investigations into both problems. New armor schemes were developed, and shell design was completely overhauled. But the damage to confidence was enormous. If battlecruisers could explode so easily, what did that say about the rest of the fleet? The Germans learned that they couldn't win a fleet action against the Royal Navy. Even with better ships and superior gunnery, they were simply outnumbered. Scheer reported to the Kaiser that the High Seas Fleet could never break the British blockade through surface action. It was a devastating admission. Germany had spent enormous sums building a fleet to challenge British naval supremacy, and it had failed. The High Seas Fleet would spend the rest of the war largely inactive, its crews growing increasingly demoralized. Both navies drew the same conclusion. The age of the battleship was ending. Future wars would be won by submarines, aircraft, and new technologies that hadn't even been invented yet. The great gunships that had dominated naval thinking for decades were already obsolete. Within months of Jutland, both sides were investing heavily in new technologies. The Germans expanded their submarine fleet, while the British began serious development of aircraft carriers and anti-submarine weapons. Jutland was the last hurrah of the battle fleet. Never again would dreadnoughts meet in line of battle, trading salvos like ships of the line at Trafalgar. The future belonged to aircraft carriers, submarines, and guided missiles, weapons that could strike from beyond the horizon without ever seeing the enemy. Young Jack Cornwell, the 16-year-old sailor I mentioned at the beginning, died of his wounds 3 days after the battle. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for staying at his post despite being mortally wounded. His courage represented the best of the old naval tradition, sailors who would die at their guns rather than abandon their duty. Cornwell's story became a symbol of British naval heroism, but it also marked the end of an era when individual courage could make a difference in naval combat. But Cornwell's sacrifice also marked the end of that tradition. Future naval battles would be fought by pilots in aircraft and submariners in steel tubes, not by sailors standing at their guns. The personal courage that had defined naval warfare for centuries was becoming less important than technology and tactics. The Battle of Jutland changed naval warfare forever, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of proving the supremacy of the battleship, it showed that even the mightiest warships were vulnerable to new weapons and tactics. The Titanic clash that was supposed to decide the war at sea actually made both sides realize that the war couldn't be won by battleships at all. Within 2 years, the Germans had abandoned surface warfare entirely and bet everything on unrestricted submarine warfare. The British began developing aircraft carriers and new anti-submarine weapons. The lessons of Jutland shaped naval strategy for the rest of the 20th century. The great irony is that Jutland was both the largest naval battle in history and the last of its kind. It was the climax of an era that was already ending, a final demonstration of naval power that proved naval power itself was changing beyond recognition. The Titanic clash that changed naval warfare forever wasn't won by superior firepower or better tactics. It was won by the realization that the age of the great gunships was over, and the future belonged to weapons that hadn't even been imagined when those magnificent battleships were built. If you found this story of the last great naval battle as fascinating as I did, make sure to subscribe to the channel and check out the videos on your screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.